What sets modern history apart from prehistory is that our history is written. We record in writing our progress through time, our achievements and milestones for posterity. The Hammurabi Code, the Ten Commandments, the Bible, the Quran, these are all written records of sacred laws from the ancient world. American democracy, too, has a lineage of written records that show the development of our nation. Each document builds on those before to make our foundation of freedom stronger. This is Documents of Destiny, the World War I years. In our program, we have three subject matter experts. Michael Sugrue, Research Fellow, the James Madison Program, Princeton University.
So the Sedition Act made it illegal to argue against the government of the United States, and also to argue for the overthrow of the government of the United States, and also to make arguments which would lead to material reduction in the contribution that the United States made to the First World War.
Priscilla Zatti, Associate Professor of Political Science, United States Naval Academy, Annapolis, Maryland.
Many of the points of Wilson's 14 points dealt with self-government, allowing states or nation-states to govern themselves, and many dealt with, and the remainder dealt with how nations should deal with each other in diplomatic relations in wartime. And I think the last, and I think the most important of Wilson's 14 points was the creation of the League of Nations.
Robert George, the McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence and Director of the James Madison Program, Princeton University.
When it came to voting, there was a great deal of variation in the colonies and then in the states after the establishment of the new republic. In the early days. In some jurisdictions, women were permitted to vote. In other jurisdictions, they weren't permitted to vote.
Declaration of War and the Selective Service Act of 1917. First, some background. In 1914, a war called the Great War broke out in Europe. The Allied powers of England, France, and Russia were pitted against the Central Powers of Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria. The United States took a neutral position at first, but neutrality eventually became impossible. In 1915, the sinking of the British luxury liner, the Lusitania, by a German submarine brought the conflict closer to home. The dead included 128 Americans. In 1916, war for the United States seemed inevitable. President Wilson prepared for it with the National Defense Act of 1916. It increased the number of soldiers in the Army from about 90,000 to 175,000, with an ultimate goal of 223,000. The National Guard size was set at 450,000. 2 months later, Congress passed another bill that appropriated $313 million to build up the Navy. Meanwhile, President Wilson tried very hard to keep us out of war. But then in early 1917, German U-boats sank 5 American ships. In addition, a secret telegram called the Zimmermann Note was discovered. It was sent from the German Secretary of State to the German minister in Mexico, proposing a Mexican alliance with Germany. The cable offered German support to Mexico to reconquer their lost territory in New Mexico, Texas, and Arizona. President Wilson and Congress could no longer maintain a neutral stance. April 4th, 1917, the United States Senate declared war. The House of Representatives voted in confirmation 2 days later. But the size of our army was insufficient to fight a battle of this magnitude. The Selective Service Act was passed the next month in May of 1917.
The Selective Service Act made it mandatory for men between the ages of 21 and 30 to register with a local draft board. The age requirement later was changed from 18 to 45-year-old men.
By the end of the war, 2.8 million men had been drafted into military service. A total of 4.8 million served in the armed forces. About half were draftees. The Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918. Many were opposed to our getting involved in the war, but some of the opponents to America's involvement were communist groups, the Socialist Party and the industrial workers of the world.
There was a considerable amount of hysteria in the U.S. about the rise of socialism, particularly among immigrant groups in eastern urban cities. There had been new immigration at the end of the 19th century. Instead of Celts and Anglos, what we had is a new group that came from Eastern Europe and also from Southern Europe. Many of these people had been exposed to certain radical traditions in European politics. A considerable anti-war movement developed in these groups. For example, there were a large number of German immigrants who had ties back to Germany that didn't want to see America side against Germany in the First World War. There is also a certain socialist movement or some element of socialist movement that develops, and the powers in Washington saw this as a threat to the war effort and a threat to America's future political development.
To silence their opposition, Congress passed the Espionage Act in 1917, and 1 year later, the Sedition Act.
The Sedition Act was aimed at American citizens, whereas the Espionage Act was aimed at foreigners on American soil whose goal was to overthrow the U.S. government.
These laws made it illegal to utter, print, write, or publish any disloyal or abusive language criticizing the United States government, the flag, or the military. Opposition to the draft, the sale of war bonds or war industries also became a crime. The international political climate of the day is important to bear in mind. In 1917, the Russian Revolution overthrew Nicholas, the Tsar of Russia, and the Communist Party took the reins of government.
So there is considerable grounds for concern that this international communist movement would make America one of its battlegrounds. And preemptively, the government in Washington, that during Wilson's administration and the Republican administrations that came after it, vigorously challenged socialist organizations.
Now some protesters may have been genuinely disloyal to America, while others may have been merely exercising their right to freedom of speech.
The problem is much the same as the problem we encountered with the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798. There is a potential for danger and subversion in the exercise of free speech, but on the other hand, when you clamp down on seditious libel and seditious speech and seditious organizations, there is justifiable concern that this will erode civil liberties.
A very famous Supreme Court case grew out of the Sedition and Espionage Acts, Schenck versus the United States.
Schenck was the Secretary General for the Socialist Party and was accused of passing out pamphlets encouraging those that have been drafted to not fight for their country. And for that, he is arrested and charged under these acts.
The majority opinion of the Supreme Court in the Schenck case is delivered by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr. He reasons that in ordinary times, this speech might be protected by the First Amendment,